For 13 years, the official story was drowning, a tragic end to a father-son fishing trip cut short, but a newly discovered camcorder, its final recording salvaged from a corroded tape, plays his father's last desperate plea from beyond the grave. The warning wasn't just a father's fear, it was a key, and now the people who silenced him know his son has just turned it in the lock. Ethan pried open the corroded battery compartment of the camcorder, the plastic groaning before it finally snapped. 13 years in a damp cardboard box in the basement had fused it shut, but the tape inside looked miraculously preserved, a small black rectangle of forgotten time. He remembered his father Mark buying the camera specifically for that fishing trip, boasting about capturing the monster fish they were going to land on Heron Lake. He didn't own the right equipment to play the tape, a relic from a different technological age. A specialty shop downtown charged him $100 to digitize the contents onto a thumb drive, the technician handing it over with a look of bored pity. Back in his apartment, the city's evening noise muted by closed windows, Ethan slid the drive into his laptop. The file opened instantly. The screen filled with the choppy, pixelated image of his father's face, younger than his own was now, his skin pale and slick with spray from the lake. The boat pitched violently, the camera struggling to hold focus. Mark wasn't smiling. His eyes, wide and frantic, darted just past the lens, as if looking at someone standing behind the person filming. He looked terrified. The engine whined in the background, a high, desperate sound that didn't match Ethan's memory of their lazy trolling speed that day. The official report said the boat capsized in a sudden squall, but the sky in the video was a sheet of flat, unforgiving gray. No squall, no rain, just wind and the sound of his father's ragged breathing. For a moment, Ethan's mind disconnected, a strange calm washing over him as he watched a ghost. This was just a video. It couldn't change the fact that his father was gone, that he had drowned, that 15-year-old Ethan had been found hours later clinging to a piece of the overturned hull, half dead from exposure. The video glitched, horizontal lines tearing across the image. Mark's mouth opened, forming words that were lost in a burst of static, a sound like grinding metal. Ethan leaned closer to the speakers, his own breathing catching in his throat. He saw his father's chest heave, a final desperate intake of air. The static cleared for less than a second. Just long enough for two words to cut through the noise, clean and sharp, a direct command from a dead man to his son. "Run, Ethan." The screen went black. The recording ended. Ethan sat motionless, the two words echoing in the silent apartment. They were not a plea, they were an order. He played it again, and again. The same frantic eyes, the same churning water, the same electronic shriek that swallowed all but that final terrifying instruction. It rewired his brain. 13 years of carefully constructed grief and acceptance crumbling into dust. The narrative of a tragic accident, the story that had defined his young adulthood, was a lie. His father hadn't been filming the scenery, he had been recording a message, a warning, and he hadn't been alone on that boat. The way his eyes looked past the camera, the sheer panic etched on his face, it wasn't the fear of a storm, it was the fear of a man staring down his own murderer. Ethan stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked to the window and looked down at the street below. The cars passing, the people walking their dogs, everything seemed unreal, a scene from a life that was no longer his. The recording didn't just hold his father's last moments, it held a secret that had stayed submerged for 13 years. A cold certainty settled in his stomach. His father had been silenced to protect that secret, and by finding the message, by hearing that warning, Ethan had just announced to whoever was listening that he was ready to finish what his father started. He felt a sudden prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. The hunt wasn't starting, it was resuming. He turned from the window, his gaze falling on the laptop. The black screen reflected his own face, pale and strained, his eyes wide with a fear he was just beginning to understand. It was the same look his father had worn. The illusion of a simple tragic death was gone, replaced by a darker, more complex truth. His father hadn't stumbled into his grave, he had been pushed, and the people who pushed him had just been given a reason to believe his son was about to follow in his footsteps. The recording wasn't an ending, it was a starting pistol. Ethan replayed the recording for the 10th time, the image degrading slightly with each loop. He ignored the static, ignored his father's face, and forced his focus onto the background, the periphery, searching for a detail he had missed. His finger hovered over the pause button, his mind racing, trying to see the scene through his father's eyes, to understand what he was trying to show in those final frantic seconds. Then he saw it. On his father's lap, held down by one trembling hand, was a folded fishing guide, the laminated map of Heron Lake they had bought at the marina that morning. It was a detail so mundane he had dismissed it completely. But Mark's gaze kept flicking down to it, a microsecond glance almost imperceptible between the panicked stares past the camera. Ethan paused the frame. The resolution was poor, a smear of colors and pixels, but the map was unmistakable. He zoomed in, the image dissolving into a blocky mess. It was useless. He ran the clip again, this time watching his father's hand. It wasn't just holding the map down against the wind, his thumb was pressing into it. Hard. He played the clip in slow motion, frame by agonizing frame. As the boat lurched, the camera tilted down, offering a clearer, fleeting view of the map for less than half a second. Pause. Zoom. The image was still blurry, but it was enough. Tiny, almost invisible dots marked the paper, pressed into the surface with the tip of a pen. They weren't random, they were deliberate, clustered around specific coves and inlets on the lake's northern shore. Ethan took a screenshot, opened an image editor, and began to painstakingly trace the points. His hands shook as he connected them. It wasn't a route, it was a shape, a stylized angular symbol that looked like a broken gear or a fractured star. It meant nothing to him, a cryptic glyph left behind by a dying man. A new kind of cold, sharper than grief, seeped into him. His father's message wasn't just the two words, the entire recording was the message. The video was the lock, the frantic performance a distraction, and the map was the key. Mark wasn't just warning him, he was giving him directions. He had been creating a coded map in his last moments alive. Every panicked glance, every shaky breath was a performance to buy himself a few more seconds to leave this one final clue. The terror on his face was real, but it was also a tool. Ethan printed the screenshot and stared at the symbol. It was a piece of a puzzle he never knew existed. Who would it mean something to? What was his father, a mid-level data analyst for a logistics company, involved in that required secret symbols and dying warnings? The man he knew was quiet, methodical, a creature of habit who enjoyed fishing and crosswords. This man, the one on the screen, was a stranger. He searched online, typing in descriptions of the symbol, broken gear logo, angular star symbol. The results were a meaningless flood of corporate branding and esoteric religious icons. He was getting nowhere. The symbol was designed not to be found, at least not by accident. It was meant for a specific person. A thought struck him, so jarring he felt it physically. Maybe the message wasn't for him. Maybe Ethan was the only part meant for his son. The map, the symbol, that was for someone else. Someone his father trusted. Someone who would know what it meant. The weight of this possibility settled on him. He wasn't just the recipient of a warning, he was a courier. He was holding a message he didn't understand, for an ally he didn't know against an enemy he couldn't see. For 13 years, the people who killed his father believed their secret was safe, drowned, and buried. Now, a 28-year-old man in a quiet apartment was staring at the key they had missed. They didn't know he had it. Not yet. But the moment he used it, the moment he showed that symbol to the right or wrong person, he would light a beacon. He looked back at the screen, at his father's face frozen in a mask of fear and determination. The simple grief he had carried for over a decade felt like a luxury now. It had been replaced by a far more demanding emotion, responsibility. He had to know what the symbol meant. He had to understand why his father was murdered. He had to find the person this map was intended for, and he had to do it before his father's killers realized their secret hadn't died with him. The past was no longer a memory. It was an active threat, and it had just been handed to him on a thumb drive. The symbol was a dead end online, but it wasn't meant for the digital world. It was a relic like the camcorder tape from an analog time of secrets passed by hand. Ethan spent 2 days running on caffeine and paranoia, cross-referencing the symbol with old news articles, corporate archives, and academic papers related to industries in the region from 13 years ago. Nothing. He shifted his focus from the symbol itself to his father's life. Mark had been a data analyst at a firm called Logicor, but his real passion was environmental activism. He wrote letters to the editor, attended town hall meetings about water quality, and volunteered for local conservation groups. It was this quiet, persistent thread that Ethan followed. He found a series of articles from a small, now-defunct local paper, all written by the same journalist, Sarah Jenkins. Her byline was aggressive, her reporting relentless. She wrote about corporate malfeasance, environmental dumping, and land use disputes. One of her last major pieces was an investigation into a tech firm called Omnigen, which had proposed building a research campus near Heron Lake, the same lake where his father died. The article series ended abruptly. A few months later, a short notice in a different paper mentioned Jenkins had been fired for fabricating sources, her career publicly destroyed. After that, she vanished. In the comments section of a 13-year-old blog post lamenting her downfall, a single anonymous user had posted a string of characters. It was gibberish, until Ethan realized it was a simple substitution cipher. He decoded it in minutes. It was a set of GPS coordinates pointing to a remote patch of forest 200 miles north. 2 days later, Ethan's car struggled up a rutted, unpaved track that was more of a suggestion than a road. He found the cabin tucked into a grove of pine trees, smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was small and defensive, with a single window facing the path. As he approached, the cabin's heavy wooden door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, holding a shotgun. She was in her late 40s, her face weathered, and her eyes narrowed with a suspicion so deep it looked like a permanent part of her. "That's far enough," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "Are you Sarah Jenkins?" Ethan asked, holding his hands up where she could see them. "Depends who's asking," she replied, the shotgun not wavering. Ethan took a risk. He pulled the printed screenshot of the map symbol from his jacket pocket and held it up. "My father sent me." Sarah Sipst's eyes locked onto the paper. Her expression didn't soften, but the hard line of her mouth tightened. A flicker of something, recognition, shock, fear, passed through her. She lowered the gun an inch. Mark Sipst dead. "He left a message," Ethan said. "This was part of it." She stared at him for a long, silent moment, her mind clearly working, weighing possibilities and threats. "Get inside," she finally ordered, stepping back. The cabin's interior was a single, cramped room. Every wall was covered, floor to ceiling, with a sprawling collage of newspaper clippings, maps, photographs, and handwritten notes, all connected by a web of red yarn. It was the physical manifestation of a 13-year-old obsession. In the center of it all, pinned to a large corkboard, was the Omnigen corporate logo. "He was your source, wasn't he?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "He was my best source," Sarah corrected, her back to him as she bolted the door. "He was an analyst at a logistics firm that Omnigen subcontracted. He saw something in their shipping manifests that shouldn't have been there, things they were moving out to a black site near the lake." She turned to face him, her eyes burning with an intensity that felt both brilliant and unhinged. "He was careful. Anonymous. He contacted me through dead drops and encrypted emails. The symbol was our sign. His way of confirming a message was from him." "Where did you get this?" "From a video. The last one he ever took, on the boat." Sarah Sipst's face went pale. "They told me it was an accident. A storm." "There was no storm," Ethan said, the words feeling heavy and final. He knew they were coming for him. He recorded it. She sank onto a small wooden stool, the shotgun resting against her leg. For the first time, she looked not like a paranoid recluse, but like a woman mourning a friend she had lost twice. So they got to him. And they got to me. They planted a fake source, fed me bad information, and discredited my entire investigation, ruined me. I've been hiding here ever since. She looked around the room, at the chaotic map of her life's work. I never stopped, though. I knew the Omnigen story was real. I knew they were covering up something huge. "What is it?" Ethan pressed. "What were they doing?" "I don't know for sure," Sarah admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. Mark was about to give me the final piece, the hard evidence. He said it would prove everything. He told me he'd hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere they'd never think to look. She met his eyes, a new, urgent light in them. He said if anything happened to him, he'd make sure I got the key. Sarah walked over to a loose floorboard near the hearth and pulled it up. From the dark space beneath, she retrieved a small, dust-covered lockbox. She opened it and removed a single, old-fashioned brass key attached to a simple metal tag. The number 344 was stamped into it. Mark gave this to me at our last meeting, a week before he died, she explained, her voice tight. He said it was for a safe deposit box at a bank downtown. He told me to hold it and wait for his signal. The symbol was the signal. She pressed the key into Ethan's hand. It felt cold and heavy, a direct link to his father's final days. He said the evidence inside would bring Omnigen down, she continued. Documents, data, whatever he found, it's in that box, a sliver of hope cut through the paranoid shell she had built around herself. After 13 years, this was it. The proof. The drive back to the city was a blur. Ethan clutched the key in his pocket, the metal warming to his touch. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of purpose that edged out the fear. He was no longer just running or hiding. He was about to recover the weapon his father had died to create. The bank was an old, formidable building with granite columns and echoing marble floors. The process was suffocatingly formal. A stern-faced manager verified his identity, checked the key against their records, and led him down a carpeted staircase into the vault. The air was cool and still. The manager used his own key in conjunction with Ethan's, the locks turning with a satisfying heavy click. He pulled out the long metal box, placed it on a small table in a private viewing room, and left, closing the door behind him. For a moment, Ethan just stared at the box. Everything was in here, the reason for his father's death. The end of 13 years of lies, justice. He lifted the lid. The box was empty. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. He ran his hands along the smooth, felt-lined bottom, searching for a false panel, a hidden compartment. There was nothing. No documents, no hard drives, no envelopes, just cold, empty metal. A wave of nausea washed over him. It was a dead end. 13 years of waiting, Sarah's isolation, his father's sacrifice, all for nothing. Someone had gotten here first. But as his fingers traced the bottom of the box one last time, they brushed against a small square of glossy paper. He picked it up. It was a photograph. It was a picture of him taken from across the street, walking his dog just 2 days ago. He was looking down at his phone, oblivious. The image was sharp, professional. In the corner, almost lost in the shadows, was the faint reflection of a black sedan in a shop window. The air left his lungs. This wasn't a dead end. It was a message. It wasn't, "We beat you to it." It was, "We see you." The sterile quiet of the viewing room suddenly felt menacing. The single bulb overhead seemed to buzz with hostile energy. They knew he was looking. They knew about Sarah. They had been watching him since the moment he plugged in that thumb drive. They had let him follow the clues. They let him find the key and come to the bank, all to deliver this one, silent, brutal threat. His paranoia from the other night wasn't just a feeling, it was a fact. They had been on him the entire time. They were probably outside right now. He crumpled the photograph in his fist, his knuckles white. The hope he'd felt moments before curdled into a cold, hard rage. This wasn't just a corporate cover-up anymore, it was personal. They weren't just protecting a secret, they were taunting him, playing with him. They wanted him to know he was powerless. They wanted him to feel the same fear his father must have felt. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He had to get back to Sarah. He had to warn her. He walked out of the viewing room, his face a neutral mask, and handed the empty box back to the manager. "Find everything you were looking for?" the man asked politely. Ethan met his gaze. "More than I expected," he said, his voice steady. As he walked out of the bank and into the bright afternoon sun, every passerby seemed like a threat, every car slowing down a potential tale. The photograph in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. They had emptied the box, but in doing so they had given him something else. They had confirmed the stakes, and they had made a fatal mistake. They thought the picture would make him run. Instead, it made him want to fight. Ethan burst through the door of Sarah's cabin, not bothering to knock. "They know," he said, his voice ragged as he slammed the bolt shut behind him. He threw the crumpled photograph onto the table. The box was empty. "They left this." Sarah smoothed out the picture, her face hardening as she recognized Ethan. "They were watching you, which means they could have followed you here." She immediately moved to the single window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. "They're playing with us. They want us scared." "It worked," Ethan admitted, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "It's over. The evidence is gone." "No," Sarah said, turning from the window, her eyes sharp. Mark was smarter than that. He was paranoid. He would have made a backup. He must have. She gestured to a dusty stack of electronics in the corner. "He gave me his old office equipment for safekeeping a month before he died. Said it was outdated, but he didn't want to just throw it away." Among the obsolete monitors and tangled cables were two bulky beige computer towers from the early 2000s. They looked like museum pieces. "He wouldn't have put the only copy in a bank," Sarah insisted. "He would have hidden it in plain sight. Something they'd overlook." For the next several hours, they worked feverishly, prying open the old machines and pulling out the hard drives. The first one was a dud, filled with nothing but old operating system files and spreadsheets of company logistics, his father's legitimate work. But the second drive was different. It was almost entirely blank, wiped clean, except for a handful of fragmented data files, their names garbled into random strings of letters and numbers. "It's a ghost," Sarah murmured, staring at the screen of her own modern laptop, now connected to the ancient drive. "He wiped it, but the data isn't completely gone. He must have used a military-grade shredder program, but parts of it remain like shadows." She ran a recovery program, her fingers flying across the keyboard. He wanted it to look clean to a casual inspection, but he left just enough behind for someone to salvage. Slowly, painfully, the program began to stitch the fragments together. Corrupted video files, unreadable documents, but then a single intact text file appeared on the screen. It was a log file, a set of notes from his father. Entry 1, they're moving the assets from Site Alpha. The manifests are falsified. Dr. Thorne is getting sloppy. He's panicked about the failures. Entry 2, the side effects are worse than they documented. Subject 12 had a complete psychotic break. They listed the cause of death as a hiking accident. I have the real coroner's report. Entry 3, I've compiled everything. The trial data, the victim list, Thorne's internal memos, it's all in the main file. But it's too big to move easily. I've had to encrypt it with the dual-key protocol. Ethan and Sarah stared at the screen. This was it, the ghost of the evidence. Dual-key protocol, Sarah said, reading the words aloud. That means you need two keys to unlock it. One is digital, probably hidden somewhere on this drive, but the other... Ethan's eyes scanned the last line of the log. Entry 4. The physical key is secure. They'll never find it. It's the one thing that always pointed me north. The one thing I made sure Ethan would remember. Ethan's breath hitched. The one thing that always pointed me north, it wasn't a riddle, it was a memory. He was 10 years old on a camping trip with his dad in the Adirondacks. He had gotten turned around in the woods, lost for a few terrifying hours as dusk began to fall. His father had found him, not angry but calm. He had pulled a heavy antique brass compass from his pocket. It will always show you the way home, Ethan, Mark had said, placing it in his son's hand. Never lose it. It always points north. It was his father's most prized possession, his grandfather's before him. After the funeral, overwhelmed with grief and wanting to give his Uncle David something of his brother's to remember him by, Ethan had given it to him. He hadn't seen it since. A compass, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. An old brass compass. Sarah looked at him, her expression a mix of awe and urgency. Your father was a genius. Hiding a digital key inside a physical object. Where is it? I gave it to my uncle, Ethan said, a sick feeling rising in his chest. My father's brother, David, after the funeral. A new layer of the conspiracy snapped into focus. The empty box wasn't just a threat, it was a misdirection. They wanted him to think the evidence was gone forever. They had no idea the real proof was sitting on this drive, waiting for a key that was, at this moment, resting on a mantelpiece in his uncle's suburban home. "You have to get it back," Sarah said, her tone leaving no room for argument, now before they realize what they've missed. The 2-hour drive to his uncle's house felt like an eternity. Every car in his rearview mirror was a potential tail, every flicker of headlights a signal. He thought about Uncle David, the man who had stepped in after his father's death, who had taken him to baseball games and helped him with his college applications. He was family. He was the one person Ethan felt he could still trust. He parked a block away from the well-kept colonial house and approached on foot, cutting across a neighbor's lawn. The lights were on in the living room. He crept up to the side of the house, peering through the window. David was there, pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace, a phone pressed to his ear. Ethan's first instinct was to knock, to explain the situation, and ask for the compass. But something in his uncle's posture stopped him. David looked stressed, his movements agitated. Ethan strained to hear, the thick glass of the window muffling the words. "Don't know how he found out," David was saying, his voice low and tense. "The Jenkins woman is involved." "Yes, that one? I thought she was out of the picture for good." A cold dread washed over Ethan, rooting him to the spot. He felt the blood drain from his face. David stopped pacing and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "No, the package is secure. The original is gone. Just as we planned. He went to the bank today. The photo should have been enough to scare him off the trail for good." There was a pause. David listened, nodding. "But there's a problem," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "The father, Mark, he was clever. He had backups, redundancies. The analyst thinks the original files might be encrypted with a physical component." Ethan felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He couldn't breathe. "We're trying to locate it now," David said into the phone. "It could be anything. Something from his childhood, a family heirloom. We're compiling a list." He glanced up, his eyes sweeping across the mantelpiece above the fireplace. They lingered for a second on the old brass compass sitting there, glinting in the lamplight. Then David's voice turned chillingly calm, the voice of a man delivering a routine status report to a superior. "Don't worry, I have it under control. If the boy comes here, I'll handle it. I'll find out what he knows." He listened for another moment. "Yes, I understand. The asset is my nephew, but I know what's at stake. The project comes first. It always has." He hung up. The world tilted on its axis. The image of the kind, supportive uncle shattered, replaced by the reality of a company man, a traitor who had been standing by for 13 years, watching him grieve. David hadn't been comforting a nephew, he had been monitoring a threat. His kindness was a lie, his sympathy an act of surveillance. He was part of it. He had been part of it from the very beginning. His father's death, the cover-up, the empty box. David knew. He knew it all. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound, it felt like a physical blow. He had been complicit in his own brother's murder. Ethan backed away from the window, stumbling blindly into the darkness of the yard. The compass wasn't just a key to a file, it was the last piece of a puzzle he had just solved, and the answer was sickening. He had no allies left in his family. He was completely, utterly alone. Rage, pure and hot, burned through the shock. He wasn't just getting a key anymore, he was taking back the last piece of his father that hadn't been tainted by the lies. He looked at the front door, then at the living room window. David was still standing by the fireplace, his back turned. He had to get that compass, and he had to do it without his uncle knowing he had been discovered. The hunt had narrowed to a single point, the man in that house and the object on his mantel, the man who had betrayed his own blood. Ethan didn't hesitate. He circled around to the back of the house, his mind a cold, clear machine of purpose. The grief and shock had crystallized into a single objective. He tested the handle on the sliding glass door to the kitchen, unlocked. David had always been careless about that. He slid the door open just enough to slip through, his feet silent on the linoleum floor. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of the television from the living room. He could see his uncle's silhouette through the doorway, now seated in an armchair watching the news. The mantelpiece was on the far side of the room. Getting to it without being seen was impossible. He needed a distraction. His eyes scanned the kitchen, landing on the microwave. He opened it, placed a balled-up piece of aluminum foil from the counter inside, and set the timer for 10 seconds. He slipped back out the sliding door, closing it silently, and sprinted around to the front of the house. Through the window he watched. The microwave beeped. A second later, a shower of bright white sparks erupted inside it, followed by a loud crackling pop and the smell of burnt electronics. David jumped from his chair. What the hell? He hurried towards the kitchen to investigate the noise. That was his chance. Ethan burst through the front door, heart pounding. He ran straight for the fireplace, his eyes locked on the prize. He snatched the antique brass compass from the mantel, its metal cool and heavy in his palm. It felt like reclaiming a part of his own history. "Ethan!" David's voice called out from the kitchen, a mix of confusion and alarm. "What are you doing here?" Ethan didn't answer. He turned and sprinted back out the front door, just as his uncle appeared in the living room doorway, his face a mask of shock that quickly morphed into cold fury when he saw the empty spot on the mantel. "Stop!" David shouted, his voice no longer that of a concerned uncle, but of an operative who had lost control of a situation. Ethan was already down the driveway and on the street, running harder than he ever had in his life. He could hear his uncle's footsteps pounding on the pavement behind him, surprisingly fast. Headlights swept the street as Sarah's car screeched around the corner, the passenger door flying open. "Get in!" she yelled. Ethan dove into the moving car, landing awkwardly in the seat. He slammed the door shut as Sarah stomped on the accelerator. The tires squealed, and the car fishtailed before shooting down the dark suburban street. In the rearview mirror, Ethan saw his uncle standing under a streetlight, phone already to his ear, his face contorted with rage. He was reporting his failure. "Did you get it?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. Ethan opened his hand. The brass compass lay on his palm, gleaming under the dashboard lights. "I got it." They were clear for now, disappearing into the labyrinth of the city's underbelly. Sarah pulled into a deserted, echoing concrete parking garage and killed the engine. In the relative silence, broken only by the drip of water from an overhead pipe, Ethan examined the compass. It was beautiful and old, the needle still pointing faithfully north. He remembered his father showing him how it worked, the patient explanation of magnetic fields. There were no obvious seams or buttons. He ran his thumb over the intricate engraving on the back, a swirling floral pattern. He felt a tiny ridge, a slight imperfection in the design. Pressing down, he felt a faint click. A hair-thin seam appeared around the compass's outer edge. With his fingernail, he pried it open. The top of the compass lifted away on a tiny hinge. Inside, nestled in a perfectly carved hollow where the magnetic workings should have been, was a tiny black object no bigger than his pinky nail. A microdrive. It was the key. The real key. The one his father had died to protect, hidden inside a memory. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. It was impossibly small to hold so much truth, to be the catalyst for so much death and betrayal. "Let's see what your father wanted the world to know," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. She started the car, the engine's roar echoing through the garage as they drove off to unlock the Ghost on the drive. The chase was over. The decryption was about to begin. Back in the anonymous safety of a motel room miles away, Sarah slid the microdrive into a USB adapter and plugged it into her laptop. The system recognized it instantly. A prompt appeared on the screen, a simple black box asking for a password. "It's still locked," Ethan said, his frustration mounting. "No, this is the second part of the dual key," Sarah corrected, her focus absolute. "The drive is the physical key. This password is the digital one. Mark mentioned it in his log, the one thing that always pointed me north." "The compass," Ethan said. "But that's the object." "No," Sarah countered, her eyes scanning the text file from the Ghost drive again. "The one thing that always pointed me north. It's not just the compass, it's the word itself." She typed 4 letters into the password box. North. She hit enter. For a second, nothing happened. Then a single file icon bloomed on the desktop, a folder titled Project Nightingale. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Sarah double-clicked it. The folder opened, revealing a meticulously organized cache of files. There were spreadsheets, video logs, internal corporate memos stamped with the Omnigen logo, scanned medical reports, and audio recordings. It was a complete, unredacted archive of a secret so dark it had been worth killing for. Project Nightingale wasn't about logistics or environmental research. It was a series of illegal human trials for a direct neurological interface, a technology designed to enhance cognitive function but with catastrophic side effects. The files detailed the entire program, from inception to cover-up. They clicked open the first video file. It showed a man in a clinical setting, a small metallic port visible on the back of his neck. He was trying to complete a simple puzzle, his hands shaking violently. He started screaming about spiders crawling under his skin before collapsing in a seizure. A man in a lab coat, his face just out of frame, calmly instructed someone off-screen to administer a sedative and log the failure. They opened another file, a spreadsheet titled Subjects. It was a list of names. Beside each name was a recruitment date and a final disposition date. There were 27 names on the list. The disposition column was filled with chillingly bland terms: accidental drowning, single-car collision, went missing during hike, acute drug overdose. These weren't failures, they were victims. Omnigen wasn't just letting them die, they were actively covering it up, staging accidents and disappearances to hide the body count of their failed experiment. Ethan scanned the list, his heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He knew what he was looking for, and then he found it. Entry number 23. Subject name Mark Peterson. Recruitment date March 12, 2012. Final disposition: accidental drowning, Heron Lake, June 14, 2012. The room fell silent. There it was, in black and white, the official lie laid bare. His father hadn't just been a whistleblower who got too close. He had been a participant, a test subject. He volunteered, Ethan whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He must have joined to get inside, to gather the evidence from within. He was the ultimate source, Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and awe. He sacrificed himself to get this. They kept digging. They found the internal memos signed by the project's lead scientist, a Dr. Alistair Thorne. In them, Thorne detailed the cover-ups, ordered the falsification of reports, and expressed frustration that the interface was causing irreparable psychological damage in every subject. The technology was a catastrophic failure. The final audio file they opened was a recording of a phone call. It was grainy, but the voices were clear. One was Dr. Thorne, the other was his uncle, David. "Mark knows too much," Thorne's voice said, thin and reedy with panic. "He's been copying files. He has everything. We have to contain this." "The protocol is clear," David Sepsid's voice replied, cold and detached, a range of final disposition. "Make it look like an accident, the boat on Heron Lake. I'll handle the family narrative." Ethan shut the laptop. He couldn't hear anymore. The truth was finally out, and it was uglier than anything he could have imagined. His father's death wasn't just murder, it was a corporate execution, sanctioned by his own brother. The man who had given him the compass was a guinea pig who got too smart, a hero who had documented his own murder. "We have to find him," Ethan said, his voice hard as steel. "Thorne. He's the one who staged it. He's the one who can testify to all of this." Sarah was already typing, cross-referencing Thorne's name with public records. After Omnigen shut down the project, he fell off the map, but a man like that doesn't just disappear, he hides. A moment later, an address appeared on the screen. A low-rent apartment complex on the other side of the city. "He's running," Sarah said, "and we're going to catch him." The door to apartment 4B opened a crack, held by a tarnished brass chain. A pair of terrified eyes peered out from the gloom within. The man was gaunt, his skin the color of old paper, a tremble running through his thin frame. It was Dr. Alistair Thorne, a decade older than his picture in the Omnigen files, but just as haunted. "Go away," he rasped, trying to shut the door. Ethan put his foot in the jam, the wood groaning in protest. "We know about Project Nightingale, Doctor," Ethan said, his voice level and cold. "We have the files. We have the list of names." He held up his phone, displaying the spreadsheet with his father's name on it. The fight went out of Thorne's eyes, replaced by a look of weary resignation. He fumbled with the chain and let the door swing open. The apartment smelled of stale air and cheap whiskey. Piles of medical journals and textbooks lay scattered across the floor, a testament to a mind that couldn't stop running. "I knew this day would come," Thorne whispered, shuffling over to a worn armchair. "I told them it was unstable. The interface, it didn't just enhance cognition, it created a back door, a vulnerability. It broke every mind it touched." He looked up at Ethan, his eyes swimming with a guilt so profound it seemed to physically weigh him down. "Your father, Mark, he was different. He was the only one who seemed to resist the side effects. He was brilliant. He figured out what the project was really for." "What was it for?" Sarah pressed her own recording device, now active on the table. Thorne let out a short, bitter laugh. Enhancement was the cover story. The sales pitch. "The real goal," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "was control. The interface wasn't meant to help the user think better. It was meant to allow us to implant thoughts, commands, to make people do things without them even knowing why they were doing them." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This was bigger than a corporate cover-up. It was about creating human puppets. "It never worked," Thorne continued, his gaze distant. "The commands would get corrupted, twisted by the user's subconscious. It drove them insane. All of them." He shook his head slowly. "All except one." He lifted a trembling hand, not pointing at Ethan but at Sarah. His eyes were filled with a strange mixture of fear and pity. "We had one success," he breathed. "One perfect implantation. The subject's mind was uniquely receptive. We needed to test if a complex long-term directive would hold. We gave her a new identity, a new purpose. We built a whole new life for her, a narrative to follow." Ethan looked at Sarah. She was standing perfectly still, her face pale, a look of utter confusion on her features. "We made her a disgraced journalist," Thorne said, his words landing with sickening precision. "Obsessed with a single story. A story we fed her. We positioned her as a beacon for any potential whistleblower, a trap for anyone who got too close. A sleeper agent who didn't even know she was sleeping." Sarah took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered, "that's not true. Your source at Omnigen, the one who fed you the information that got you fired?" Thorne asked gently. "He never existed. He was a fiction we created. We destroyed your career to give you a backstory, to make you the perfect, isolated listening post, waiting for a signal." The room spun. Ethan stared at Sarah, his only ally, the woman who had guided him through this maze. Her paranoia, her off-grid cabin, her relentless obsession with Omnigen, it wasn't her own. It had all been implanted. She hadn't been investigating the conspiracy, she was a feature of it. "And your father," Thorne said, his gaze shifting back to Ethan. Mark knew. It was the last thing he figured out. He knew that the journalist he was trying to contact was compromised. That's why his last message wasn't for her. It was for you. The final twist landed, rearranging everything Ethan thought he knew. Sarah wasn't just a reporter, she was the project's only success. She was a weapon, and Omnigen still held the trigger. Her entire identity was a lie constructed by the very people she thought she was fighting. And she had led Ethan and his father's evidence directly into the heart of their trap. He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not an ally but a ghost. A flicker in Sarah's eyes, a momentary vacantness, a subtle shift in posture, as if a switch had been thrown deep inside her mind. Thorne's words had triggered something, a dormant protocol awakening. Her confusion was evaporating, replaced by a placid, unnerving calm. She was no longer Sarah Jenkins, the disgraced journalist. She was an asset being activated. "Sarah," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. Her eyes, when they met his, were cold and distant. "The directive is clear," she said, her voice flat, inhuman. "The evidence must be secured. The source must be neutralized." She began to move toward the laptop on the table, her movements efficient and devoid of her usual frantic energy. Ethan's mind raced, recalling his father's log file. The interface creates a back door, a vulnerability. His father, the man who resisted the side effects, must have found a way to exploit that vulnerability. He grabbed the laptop and scrolled frantically through the decrypted files, not looking at the evidence, but for something else, a tool his father might have left behind. He found it in a subfolder labeled Contingency. It was a single audio file named failsafe_protocol_7. "Sarah, stop," he commanded. She ignored him, her hand reaching for the laptop. He clicked the file. A sound filled the room. Not a voice or music, but a complex sequence of pulsing tones and discordant frequencies, a cascade of digital noise designed to crash a system. It was an acoustic virus. Sarah froze, her hand hovering over the laptop. Her head tilted, and a violent shudder ran through her body. She cried out, a sound of pure agony, as two warring sets of instructions battled for control of her mind. "Fight it, Sarah," Ethan yelled over the noise. Her eyes squeezed shut. My name," she stammered, her own voice struggling to break through the conditioning. "My name is Sarah Jenkins." The flat, robotic tone was gone, replaced by the raw, terrified voice of a woman clawing her way back to herself. The audio file ended. Sarah collapsed against the wall, gasping, her face slick with sweat. The ghost was gone. She was herself again. "He built a kill switch," Thorne whispered from his chair, his face a mask of disbelief. "Your father built a deprogramming key." The sound of heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs outside jolted them back to the present. "They're here," Ethan said. "David must have tracked them. Omnigen's cleanup crew was coming." "They'll kill us all," Thorne whimpered. "Erase everything." "No, they won't," Sarah said, pushing herself to her feet, her eyes blazing with a newfound fury. The fury of a woman whose entire life had been stolen. "They don't get to bury this. They don't get to win." She grabbed the laptop. "There's a local news station 2 blocks from here. A friend of mine still works the overnight shift." They didn't run. They moved with purpose. Out the back fire escape, down the alley, Thorne stumbling between them, they burst into the nearly empty lobby of the WPKX news station, a security guard jumping to his feet in alarm. "We need to get into the control room," Sarah said, flashing a press pass that was 13 years out of date but still looked official enough. "This is a national security issue." Before the guard could react, they were past him and through the doors. They found the main broadcast control room empty, a single producer staring at a bank of monitors. Ethan barricaded the door with a heavy metal desk. Sarah sat at the control board, her hands flying across the console, overriding the automated late-night programming. "I'm patching the laptop directly into the live feed," she said. "We have maybe 90 seconds before they cut the power or break down the door." Ethan turned to the main broadcast camera. The small red light on top blinked on. They were live. He held up the microdrive. "My name is Ethan Peterson. 13 years ago, my father, Mark Peterson, was murdered by the Omnigen Corporation to cover up a program called Project Nightingale." He spoke clearly and quickly, his voice steady. He laid it all out, the illegal trials. The list of victims reading their names one by one, Dr. Thorne's confession, his Uncle David's complicity. The technology of control. Sarah brought Thorne's terrified face up on a secondary screen. Then she turned the camera on herself. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I was their lead reporter, and I was also their victim. Their only successful test subject." The sound of splintering wood came from the door. They were breaking through. "The evidence is being uploaded to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency as we speak," Ethan said, looking directly into the lens, into the eyes of thousands of unseen viewers. "You can't stop it. You can't bury it. The truth is out." The door burst open. 2 men in dark suits, weapons raised, stormed into the room. But it was too late. The feed had gone out to the world, a single, desperate, and irreversible act of defiance, the secret his father had died to protect, the betrayal his uncle had orchestrated, the life that had been stolen from Sarah. It was all laid bare. The conspiracy was no longer submerged, it was exposed, live on the air, a story that could never be taken back. The broadcast ended in a blaze of static, but the truth was already running.